Welcome to Classic Poirot Tales. Good evening, dear friends. I'm so glad you could join me for a quiet evening in. A warm hello tonight to our listeners across the pond in Virginia and Kentucky, horse country, and fitting company for tonight's tale, which begins at a fox hunt in the English shires. Have you ever watched a hunt meet, or ridden out on a cold morning yourself? I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. I do read every one. Tonight's story takes us to Ferrers Hall in November 1935, where a baronet falls from a horse that has never once put a foot wrong, and Hercule Poirot, who despises horses and says so without apology, happens to be watching from the ground. If you enjoy these evenings together, you can also find us now on Spotify. The link is just below. And if you're new to this little corner of the internet, do consider subscribing. It means more than you'd think to a small channel like ours. Now, settle in, pour something warm, and let us begin. Picture it. A bright, hard morning, frost still silvering the grass, 40 riders drawn up at the covert side in their scarlet and their black, breath rising from the horses like smoke. The horn sounds. The field goes forward at the gallop, and at the very first fence, a fence he has jumped 100 times without incident, Sir Rowland Ferrers's grey gelding leaves the ground like something struck by lightning, twists in the air, and comes down wrong. 40 people see it happen. 40 people call it an accident because what else could it be? The ground was good, the tack was sound. The horse had never stumbled in 9 seasons of hunting. But there is a small foreign gentleman standing at the tree line in borrowed boots he already regrets, who did not see a horse stumble at all. He saw a horse that was hurt, suddenly, violently, and by something that is no longer there to find. And when Hercule Poirot begins to ask why a good grey should go mad in mid-air, and then, 10 minutes later, be found trembling and perfectly sound but for a broken rider beneath him, the tidy verdict of misadventure starts, very quietly, to come apart at the seams. Somewhere in that field of 40 riders is someone who knew exactly which horse would be saddled, exactly which blanket would be laid beneath it, and exactly how long it would take for the evidence to melt away into an ordinary, innocent, damp patch of sweat. Chapter 1. The Meet at Ferrers Hall. The frost had come down hard in the night, and by the time the sun was properly up over the Blackmoor country, it lay along the hedgerows like something spilled and forgotten, whitening the black branches, silvering the grass in the paddocks, so that every blade of it seemed, for an hour or two, to have been dipped separately in glass. It was the kind of cold that got into a man's boots and stayed there, and Hercule Poirot, standing at the edge of the stable yard at Ferrers Hall, in a pair of borrowed boots, 2 sizes too large and a good deal too English for his taste, was already regretting the whole enterprise. "You will feel better once you're moving, Poirot," said Captain Hastings, who had the pink, delighted look of a man in his natural element. He was checking his girth for the 3rd time, patting his hired hunter's neck with the proprietary affection of a man who has known the animal for 2 days and already loves it. Nothing like a good hard morning in the saddle to set a fellow up. "I have no intention of setting myself up in a saddle, mon ami," said Poirot, drawing his coat closer about his throat. "I shall walk, on my own 2 feet, which have served me faithfully for many years, and have never once, that I recall, attempted to throw me into a hedge." The yard was full of noise and colour, and the particular organised chaos of a meet. Grooms leading out horses already dancing with the cold and the excitement. Hounds giving tongue somewhere out of sight behind the kennels. A groom's boy running with a stirrup cup on a tray, careful not to spill it, his breath white in the air. Poirot watched it all with the fascinated horror of a man observing a ritual he does not understand and does not wish to. The horses alone seemed to him unreasonable animals, large, hot, unpredictable, entirely too close to the ground and too far from it at the same time. Their host, Sir Rowland Ferrers, moved through the yard as a man moves through a place he owns completely and has owned his whole life, with an easy, unthinking authority that Poirot found himself watching with more interest than he watched the horses. Ferrers was a big, florid man in his 50s, master of the Blackmoor for 11 years, and this morning he was in high good humour, laughing with his huntsman, clapping a young rider on the shoulder, calling instructions across the yard in a voice built for open fields. Hastings had confided the night before, over a very good claret, a difficult man to work for and an easy man to like, the kind of Englishman who ran his hunt, his estate, and his family with the same brisk, cheerful, faintly bullying confidence, and who had never in his life been told no by anyone who mattered to him. Poirot had noticed, without quite meaning to, the small currents beneath the surface of that cheerfulness. The heir, young Gerald Ferrers, standing rather too close to his uncle's stirrup, laughing rather too readily at a joke that had not, to Poirot's ear, been especially funny. A young man with the particular brightness of someone keeping something carefully out of sight. The whipper-in, a quiet, sandy, unremarkable man called Tom Rennick, moving among the hounds and the horses with the total, invisible competence of a man who has made himself indispensable by being everywhere and noticed nowhere. A groom handing him a flask, and Rennick taking it without a word of thanks, as though it were owed to him. And, at the edge of the yard, a big raw-boned farmer in a tweed coat too old for the cold, watching the whole scene with an expression that was not, Poirot thought, entirely the expression of a man who had merely come to see the hunt move off. "You are troubled, Poirot." Hastings had swung up into the saddle now, and looked down at his friend with the faint, fond exasperation of long acquaintance. "You've got that look." "I am cold, Hastings, and I am standing in a yard full of large, unpredictable animals, and I am wondering," said Poirot slowly, "why a man who owns everything he can see should look, this morning, like a man who has just told someone something they did not wish to hear." Hastings laughed and said something about grey cells taking a holiday, and the horn sounded, high and clear across the frost, and the field began to move off toward the first covert in a jingle of bit and stirrup, hounds streaming ahead of them white and gold against the dark hedges, Sir Rowland Ferrers at their head on his good grey gelding that had carried him through 9 faultless seasons, laughing still, riding into a morning that would not let him finish it. Poirot, on foot, at the tree line, watched them go. Chapter 2. The First Covert. The field moved off in good order, hounds spreading fanwise across the frosted pasture, with their sterns going like metronomes, and Hastings fell in near the front, with the easy confidence of a man who had ridden to hounds since boyhood, while Poirot, on foot, took the footpath that ran along the hedge line, a path he had privately noted the evening before, ran close enough to the first covert to give a man a very tolerable view of whatever occurred there, without requiring him to sit on anything with a mind of its own. It was, he told himself, walking briskly to keep the blood in his feet, an excellent arrangement. He would see the hunt as few of its members ever troubled to see it, not from the maddening, jolting vantage of the saddle, where a man's whole attention was given over to the animal beneath him, but from the ground, at leisure, with his little grey cells entirely his own. The first covert was a strip of gorse and bramble along the bottom of a shallow valley, and the field drew up along its edge in a long, restless line, while the huntsman cast his hounds into the cover. Poirot, coming up by the footpath, arrived in time to see an exchange that interested him considerably more than the hounds did. Sir Rowland Ferrers had drawn his horse a little apart from the others and was speaking, quietly, but with an unmistakable hardness beneath the quiet, to Tom Rennick, who sat his own mount a few feet off, with the particular stillness of a man being told something he had expected and dreaded in equal measure. Poirot could not hear the words. He did not need to. He had spent 30 years learning to read the shape of a conversation from its posture alone, and this one had the shape of an ultimatum. Ferrers's chin was up, his voice pitched low and level in the way of a man delivering a decision already made. Rennick's hands, Poirot noted, had gone very still on the reins, the stillness not of calm, but of a man holding something down by main force. It lasted perhaps 20 seconds. Then Ferrers laughed, a short, genuine laugh, as if the difficult thing had been said, and he was glad to have it behind him, and rode back to the front of the field, calling out something to his nephew that made the boy laugh too readily, in the way Poirot had already marked that morning. First fox of the day, Poirot. Hastings, cantering up alongside the footpath, flushed with cold and pleasure, gestured toward the covert, where a flash of red had broken from the gorse and gone streaking up the far slope. Hounds pouring after it in full cry, the whole field surging forward with a great collective shout. "By Jove, isn't it splendid?" "Splendid," agreed Poirot, without conviction, watching not the fox but Tom Rennick, who had not moved for a moment after Ferrers rode away, who sat his horse quite alone at the edge of the surging field, looking after his employer's back, with an expression Poirot could not immediately name and did not entirely like. The chase carried the field away down the valley and out of sight, and Poirot continued along his footpath at his own unhurried pace, arriving some minutes later at a gate where a big man in an old tweed coat stood leaning on the top bar, watching the distant riders with no expression at all that Poirot could read as pleasure. "Good morning," said Poirot pleasantly, coming to a halt beside him. "You are not riding today, monsieur." The man, Poirot placed him, from Hastings' account of the neighbourhood the evening before, as very likely to be Amos Grieve, whose farm marched with the Halls along a boundary that had been the subject of some dispute, looked at him with the flat, unhurried suspicion of a countryman assessing a stranger. "Don't hold with it," he said. "Fine for them as can afford to have a horse eat its head off in a stable for the pleasure of jumping it over another man's hedges." He nodded toward the retreating field. "That's my bottom field they're crossing now. Ferrers has the right of way, so they tell me, though I never signed nothing said so. You have had disagreements with Sir Rowland, then, on the matter?" "Had words," said Grieve shortly, and did not elaborate, and something in the set of his big shoulders suggested to Poirot that the words had not been the whole of it, that here was a man who had done a good deal more than argue, though what Poirot could not yet have said, and the farmer, evidently deciding he had said enough to a stranger in borrowed boots, touched his cap and walked off along the hedge toward his own land without another word. Poirot stood a moment at the gate, watching him go, and then looked back down the valley to where the field had gathered again at a check, the hounds casting in wide circles for a lost scent, the riders drawn up in a loose, chattering knot in the pale morning light, Sir Rowland Ferrers at their centre, laughing, alive, entirely unaware, Poirot thought with a small, unaccountable chill, that he had perhaps 20 minutes left in which to be either of those things. Chapter 3. The Check. At Long Ash Spinney. By the time Poirot came up with the field again, at the wide green ride below Long Ash Spinney, the hounds had lost their fox, and the whole loose, breathing, steaming company of riders had drawn rein to wait, while the huntsman cast them forward along the tree line, and the morning had settled, for a quarter of an hour, into the particular sociable idleness of a hunt at a check, horses blowing, flasks passed, everyone talking at once about nothing in particular, which was, Poirot reflected, taking up a discreet position by a field gate, precisely the condition under which people say the things they would never say if they thought anyone of consequence were listening. He was, in his borrowed boots and his town coat, entirely beneath the notice of a field of hunting people, and he made full use of the fact. Perfectly ridiculous of him, at his age, to think of selling, a stout woman in a hard hat was saying to her neighbour, not troubling to lower her voice, when everyone knows the young ones are worth twice what they were 3 years ago, and where the money's gone to I'm sure I couldn't say, though Maria Fenwick swears she's seen the same 3 couple of hounds advertised in an Irish sporting paper under quite another kennel name. Poirot filed this away with the neat, satisfied precision of a man adding a card to an index he is building in his mind, and moved on before the woman's eye could fall on him. Nearer the gate, young Gerald Ferrers sat his horse a little apart from the others, and Poirot, drifting close along the hedge with the unhurried air of a man merely admiring the view, caught the tail end of an exchange between the young man and a sharp-faced individual in a bowler hat who had ridden up beside him on a hireling. "Can't keep putting me off indefinitely, Mr. Ferrers. 6 months I've waited, and civilly, I think you'll allow. But a debt's a debt, and if your uncle won't—" "He won't," said Gerald, low and fast. "And don't you dare go to him, Hopgood. I swear to you I'll have it by Christmas. I've as good as got it settled. Settled how, if I may ask?" Gerald did not answer. His colour had gone up under the cold, and his hand on the rein had tightened in a way that made his horse toss its head, and the man called Hopgood, with the small, satisfied smile of a creditor who has made his point, touched his hat and let his hireling drop back into the crowd, leaving the young man alone with an expression that Poirot, watching from beneath the brim of his own borrowed cap, found intensely interesting. Not the expression of a man calculating a murder, he thought, but very much the expression of a man doing sums that will not come right, no matter how he arranges them. Somewhere behind him a horse's hoof struck a stone, and Poirot turned in time to see Tom Rennick lead Sir Rowland's grey gelding up from the rear of the field, where the second string of horses had been walked round quietly while the first covert was drawn, for it was the custom, Hastings had explained the night before, with the patient enthusiasm of a man discussing a subject he loved, for a master to change onto a fresh mount part-way through a long day, and the grey, rested and newly saddled, was being brought up now to replace the bay Ferrers had ridden since the meet. Poirot watched the changeover with more attention than the operation, on its face, seemed to warrant. Rennick held the grey's head while a groom shifted the saddle from the tired bay, working with the quick, unremarkable competence of a man who had done the same thing 10,000 times, checking the girth, settling the blanket beneath the saddle, with a single practiced smoothing motion of his gloved hand, a motion so ordinary, so entirely part of the fabric of the morning, that not one of the 40 people within 20 yards of it gave it a second glance. He could not, from where he stood, have said what troubled him about it, only that something in the smoothing of that blanket had the particular over-careful quality of a gesture performed for an audience that was not, in fact, watching, and he found himself, for no reason he could have defended to a rational man, moving a little closer along the hedge as Sir Rowland Ferrers came striding up, laughing over his shoulder at some remark of his sister-in-law's, and swung himself without ceremony into the grey's saddle. "Right then," Ferrers called, gathering his reins, his voice carrying easily across the ride. "Let's see if we can't put this fox to rights before luncheon spoils our tempers entirely." And the huntsman's horn sounded again, thin and bright in the cold air, and the hounds gave tongue as one voice from the edge of the spinney, and the field surged forward toward the first fence of the new cast, a low, easy, familiar hedge that the grey, in 9 seasons, had jumped without the smallest hesitation 100 times or more. Poirot, on foot, at the gate, watched them go, and found that his heart, for reasons he could not yet have named, had begun to beat a little faster than the morning's cold alone could account for. Chapter 4. The Fall Afterwards. When he had cause to turn the moment over many times in memory, Poirot found that certain things about it had fixed themselves with the strange, hard clarity of a photograph, while others had already blurred by the time he reached the hedge, the particular whiteness of the frost still lying in the shadow of the bank, the sound of 40 horses' breath and 40 jingling curb chains, the huntsman's horn note dying away into the cold air, and then, cutting across all of it, a sound he had never before heard a horse make and hoped never to hear again. The grey took the hedge cleanly enough. Poirot, watching from the gate with an attention he could not have explained even to himself, saw the forelegs fold and clear the top of it in the same easy, economical arc the animal had shown at every fence that morning. And it was in the half-second after landing, both hind feet still in the air, that the horse seemed to Poirot to convulse, as a man convulses who has been stung on some tender place by a wasp he did not see coming. It went up in front, twisting, a scream tearing out of it that was nothing like the ordinary grunt and snort of a startled horse. And Sir Rowland Ferrers, a big man, a good rider, a man who had sat that same saddle through 9 hunting seasons without a fall, was thrown clear up and sideways, over the horse's shoulder, and came down on the frozen ground beyond the hedge, with a sound that Poirot heard quite distinctly across 60 yards of cold morning air, and which he did not care, later, to describe to anyone who had not already guessed it. For one dreadful, suspended second, nobody moved at all. Then the field broke apart into noise, shouting, horses wheeling and plunging as their riders fought to hold them, someone screaming for the doctor who had, thank God, ridden out that morning with the rest, hounds giving tongue in confusion at the edge of things, and Hastings, white to the lips, was already off his own horse and running, and Poirot, for once in his life entirely forgetting the indignity of it, was climbing through the hedge as fast as his short legs and his borrowed boots would carry him. Sir Rowland Ferrers lay where he had fallen, on his back, one arm flung out at an angle no living arm rests at naturally, his hunting coat bright as blood against the white grass. And it took Poirot only the one look, the swift, dreadful, professional look he had given to 100 dead men across 30 years, to know that the doctor running toward them with his bag would find nothing whatever to do beyond confirming what the eye already told him. The neck had gone. Death, Poirot judged, had very likely been instantaneous, and for that, at least, one might be grateful. The grey stood 20 feet off, trembling violently, sides heaving, foam at its mouth, held now by 2 grooms who had run to catch it, and even in the chaos of the moment, Poirot found his eyes going to the animal rather than to the sad ruin of the man on the ground. For the doctor, kneeling, could do nothing further for Sir Rowland Ferrers, but the horse, still living, still trembling, was to Poirot's mind a witness that had not yet finished testifying. Bolted at the fence, someone was saying, over and over, in the particular useless way people repeat a thing in shock, as though repetition might yet unmake it. Never known him do such a thing. Good God, never known that horse put a foot wrong in his life. An accident, said another voice, older, authoritative. Poirot placed it as belonging to a heavy, red-faced man he had been told was the local coroner, out with the hunt that day as a guest, and now, by grim coincidence, precisely the official the moment required. A dreadful accident, plainly. Horse must have been stung, or startled by something in the hedge, a rabbit, a wasp even, in this cold, unlikely as it seems. These things happen, gentlemen. They happen more often than people credit. There was a murmur of agreement, the terrible, grateful agreement of a crowd of shocked people reaching gladly for the simplest explanation on offer, and the coroner was already turning to speak to the doctor about the necessary formalities, the word misadventure forming itself, Poirot could see, behind the man's eyes before a single fact had been properly examined, when a small, precise, foreign voice said, quite clearly, into the general murmur, "Before Monsieur le Coroner concludes so happily that this was an accident, I wonder if he would permit an old man to look, for one moment only, beneath the saddle blanket." Every eye in the field turned to Hercule Poirot, standing rather absurdly in his borrowed boots at the edge of the crowd, hat in hand, out of respect for the dead, and the coroner's red face went a shade redder with the particular offence of a man of consequence, interrupted by someone he does not recognize. "And who," he began, "might you?" "He is a friend of the family, and a very great deal cleverer than he looks," said Hastings loyally, coming to stand at Poirot's shoulder, still white and shaken, but entirely certain of his ground. "I should let him look, if I were you." The grooms, uncertain, glanced toward the coroner, who, after a moment's hesitation that did him some credit, gave a curt, irritated nod, and Poirot crossed to where the grey stood shivering between the 2 men holding it, and lifted, with careful, unhurried fingers, the corner of the saddle blanket that lay still beneath the displaced saddle, and found there, drying already in the pale morning sun, a damp, dark patch perhaps the size of a man's hand, rimmed at its edges with a thin white crust that might, to a careless eye, have been nothing more than salt sweat, and was, to Poirot's eye, considerably more interesting than that. Chapter 5. What the Blanket Said. The house that evening was hushed in the particular, muffled way a house goes hushed after a sudden death. Voices dropped, doors closed softly, the servants moving about their duties with the exaggerated quiet of people afraid of being thought unfeeling. And it was in the library, after a dinner eaten more for form than appetite, that Poirot at last had leisure to lay before Hastings, and before Inspector Farrow of the County Constabulary, summoned by telephone within the hour of the fall, the small collection of facts he had gathered at the hedge. "Salt," said Inspector Farrow. turning the little twist of paper over in his blunt fingers with the deep suspicion of a countryman confronted with a foreigner's cleverness. "You're telling me a man was killed with a pinch of salt, Mr. Poirot?" "I am telling you, Inspector, that a horse which has carried its master safely through 9 hunting seasons does not, on the 10th, go mad in the air at a fence it has jumped without difficulty 100 times before, unless something is done to make it do so." Poirot held up one finger. "Salt, coarse salt, packed together with crushed ice and laid beneath the saddle blanket, close against the horse's back, will lie quiet and cold and unremarkable for perhaps 10-15 minutes, long enough for the horse to be saddled, mounted, and ridden a little way, all in perfect innocence. And then, as the animal's own heat begins to work upon it, the ice softens, the salt begins to bite into flesh already damp with sweat, and in the space of a very few minutes, the horse is driven half out of its senses with a pain it cannot understand and cannot escape. For the rider is on its back, and the thing is beneath the saddle, where no amount of bucking will dislodge it before it has done its work. And then, Inspector, the ice is melted, the salt is scattered and lost in the grass, and what remains beneath the blanket is nothing more than a damp patch, such as any hard-ridden horse might show. A cruel device, and a clever one, because it does not merely kill, it disappears." Ferrer was silent a moment, turning this over with the slow, thorough skepticism of a man who did not care to be hurried into believing anything, however neatly it was presented to him. "Who saddled the horse?" he said at last. "Ah," said Poirot, and permitted himself, for the first time that grim day, a small private satisfaction. "That, Inspector, is precisely the question. And you will find, I think, that it narrows your field of suspects considerably. For a man may ride at another man's shoulder all morning without ever coming within 10 feet of his stirrup leather, but a saddle does not lift itself onto a horse's back. Someone did that this morning at the check by Long Ash Spinney, in full view of 40 people who were all looking, quite naturally, at anything but the ordinary, everyday business of changing a tired horse for a fresh one. It was Hastings, restless by the fire, who put the obvious question into words. "Well, who did saddle him, Poirot? Surely someone must have seen." "Everyone saw," said Poirot, "and no one was watching, which is not, mon ami, the same thing at all. I observed the changeover myself, from the gate, and I can tell you that a groom shifted the tack from the bay to the grey, and that it was Rennick, the second whipper-in, who held the grey's head and settled the blanket beneath the saddle with his own hand. A small, ordinary gesture, performed in the middle of a crowd of 40 people, every one of whom was watching the hounds, or their neighbour's horse, or their own girth, and not one of whom, I think you will find, could swear on oath to having watched Rennick's hands for longer than half a second." Inspector Farrow's pencil had stopped moving. "You're accusing the whip." "I am accusing no one, Inspector. I am observing only that the whipper-in is a man whose entire duty, morning after morning, season after season, is to be everywhere among the horses and hounds, unremarked, taken for granted, the invisible machinery that keeps a hunt running, and that such a man, if he wished to do a thing of this kind, would find it a great deal easier than any other person in that field, and would be a great deal less likely to be noticed doing it." He paused. "It remains only to discover why such a man should wish his master dead." That question occupied rather less of the evening than Poirot had expected, for it was Farrow himself, dispatched to the estate office, to secure the dead man's papers against the morning's formal inquiries, who returned within the half-hour holding a small, leather-bound ledger with the peculiar carefulness of a man who has found something he does not yet fully understand, but already dislikes. "Kennel book," he said, laying it on the table between them. "Housekeeper says Sir Rowland kept it locked in his desk himself, wouldn't let anyone else near it, which struck her as odd, seeing as the huntsman generally keeps his own. And look here," he turned the pages to a section near the back, columns of names and dates and figures in a careful, unhurried hand, quite unlike the brisk entries earlier in the book. 3 couple of young hounds, entered here as dead of distemper 18 months back. Only Maria Fenwick, out with the hunt today. I've had her account taken already. Swears she's seen the very same hounds, or as good as, advertised for sale in an Irish sporting paper not 3 months since, under another kennel's name entirely. Poirot took the ledger and turned the pages slowly, his face very still, and Hastings, watching him, had the sudden uncomfortable sense that his friend had already, in some part of his mind, arranged the whole dreadful shape of the thing, and was now only waiting, with the patience of a man who has learned better than to hurry a truth before it is ready to be spoken, for the rest of the household to catch up with him. "So," said Poirot softly, closing the book, "Sir Rowland discovers that hounds entered as dead have in fact been sold, quietly, profitably, abroad. And a man who has built his whole life on being trusted, on being the one person everywhere among the horses whom no one thinks to watch, learns that his master has found him out, and has told him so, to his face, on the Saturday before he died." He looked up. "I think, Inspector, we had better have a very careful conversation with Mr. Tom Rennick in the morning, though I will confess to you both that I do not yet believe the answer will prove quite so simple as a locked ledger and an angry word." Chapter 6. The Whipper-in. Tom Rennick was found in the kennels before 7 the next morning, feeding the hounds their mash with the same unhurried, competent hands Poirot had watched settle a saddle blanket the day before, and if he had heard, as he must have heard, for the whole household had heard by breakfast, that Inspector Farrow wished a word with him, he gave no sign of it beyond a certain careful stillness about the mouth that a less attentive man than Poirot might have taken for simple grief. "You'll forgive me if I go on with my work while we talk, sir," he said, when Farrow had put the first questions to him in the cold stone yard, the hounds crowding and jostling at the trough. "They've to be fed regardless of what's happened, and there's none but me to do it this morning." "You saddled the grey yesterday, at the check," said Farrow, without preamble. "Change over from the bay." "I did, same as I've done 100 times, and 100 more before that. And you noticed nothing wrong with the blanket, nothing beneath it." For the first time something moved behind Rennick's eyes, not, Poirot thought, watching closely from the shadow of the kennel wall, the flare of a guilty man caught out, but something quieter and stranger, closer to bewilderment. "Wrong with it, how? It were a clean blanket. I put it on myself from the tack room not 20 minutes before." "Sir Rowland spoke to you at the meet yesterday," said Poirot, stepping forward at last, his voice mild, before the first covert was drawn, a private word, at some little distance from the field. "I saw it myself, monsieur, though I did not hear it." The hand that had been ladling mash into the trough went still. Rennick straightened slowly, and when he spoke again his voice had lost its easy working man's flatness and taken on something harder, more careful. The voice, Poirot thought, of a man choosing each word as he might choose his footing on wet stone. "He told me he knew about the hounds," Rennick said at last. "The 3 couple I'd sold on, to a dealer in County Meath, and entered dead of distemper so the books would balance. He'd found the discrepancy himself, going over the accounts for the hunt committee. He was a careful man about money, was Sir Rowland, whatever else you might say of him, and he told me straight out, Saturday evening, that Monday would be my last day in his service, and that he'd not have me prosecuted if I went quiet and didn't argue it." "And this angered you," said Farrow, pencil moving. "It shamed me," said Rennick, and there was, Poirot noted, no attempt whatever in the man's voice to soften or excuse the fact, only a flat, exhausted honesty that Poirot had learned, across many years and many liars, to distinguish from its counterfeit. 22 years I've served this hunt, man and boy, and I did a wicked, foolish thing, and I knew it wicked when I did it, and I'd have taken my dismissal and been glad it weren't worse. I'd no cause to kill him for it, Inspector. He was giving me a mercy I'd no right to expect, and I knew it." "Yet you are the one man," said Poirot gently, "who saddled that horse, alone, at a moment when 100 eyes were on the hounds, and not on your hands." "Aye," said Rennick, and met Poirot's eyes with a bleakness that was, Poirot thought, either the most convincing performance he had witnessed in 30 years of professional lying, or no performance at all. "And I've turned that over all night, sir, lying awake with it, for I saddled that horse same as I've saddled 1,000 horses, and I'd stake my soul there was nothing beneath that blanket when it left my hand but the blanket itself. If someone put a thing there to hurt that horse, they put it there after I'd done my work and before Sir Rowland mounted. And I'll tell you plain, there's precious few minutes in a saddling and a mounting where a horse stands unwatched, but there's some. It was a fair point, and Poirot, walking back toward the house some minutes later with Hastings at his side, found himself turning it over with genuine interest rather than mere professional caution. "You believe him?" said Hastings, not quite a question. "I believe," said Poirot carefully, "that a man who has just been caught in a shameful theft, and forgiven it rather than prosecuted for it, has rather less motive for murder than the coroner's tidy verdict would suggest, and a very great deal more motive for simple, grateful relief. It is the too obvious suspect, mon ami, who most rewards a second look, not because he is always innocent, but because the world is so ready to believe him guilty that no one troubles to ask what stood between the saddling and the mounting, in that small window of a few minutes, when the horse stood tethered and unwatched, while Sir Rowland finished his conversation with his sister-in-law. "Good Lord," said Hastings, stopping in the gravel drive. "You mean someone else could have got at the horse afterward?" "I mean," said Poirot, "that we have been so charmed by the neatness of an angry servant with a guilty secret that we have not yet asked ourselves who else, in that crowded field, stood near enough to a tethered, saddled horse in those few unwatched minutes to slip a hand beneath a blanket that had already been set in its proper place. And I find, when I ask myself that question honestly, that the list is a good deal shorter and a good deal more interesting than Inspector Farrow's arrest warrant would presently allow for. Chapter 7. The Few Unwatched Minutes. It was a small thing, in the end, that gave Poirot his window. A small thing, and Miss Amelia Ferrers, the dead man's sister-in-law, who supplied it, without in the least understanding what she had done, over tea in the morning-room, while the blinds were still half drawn, out of respect for the house's mourning. "We spoke for a good 5 minutes, perhaps longer," she said, turning her cup restlessly in its saucer. "Rowland liked to talk to me at a check. He said I was the only one in the field who didn't bore him with hound talk. We were discussing the church roof fund, of all the ridiculous things, while poor Rennick got the grey ready, and then Rowland simply excused himself and mounted, and—" Her voice caught, and she set the cup down with great care, as though afraid of what her hands might do if she did not master them. "And in those 5 minutes," said Poirot gently, "Sir Rowland stood with his back half turned to the horse. Who else, madame, was near enough to it to touch it, in that time, without remark?" She considered this with the genuine effort of a woman trying honestly to be useful, rather than merely helpful. "Well, Gerald was there, of course. He'd ridden up to speak to his uncle about something, though Rowland waved him off rather shortly. I remember thinking it odd. And that dreadful little man Hopgood, on the hireling, I didn't like the look of him at all. And Mr. Grieve was at the gate, though I shouldn't have thought he'd come so close to the horses, not being a hunting man." Poirot's eyes had sharpened at the second name. Monsieur Grieve was present at the check. I had understood him to have remained at his own gate, some distance off. He'd come down to speak to the huntsman about the state of a gap in his hedge, some nonsense about hounds getting through onto his land, and he stood about rather sullenly at the edge of things for a few minutes before he went off again. I noticed him because he's not usually one to come anywhere near the field if he can help it. It was, Poirot reflected, walking out afterward into the cold, bright morning, with this fresh and interesting fact turning over pleasantly in his mind, precisely the sort of small contradiction that a public spectacle so reliably produced. For every one of the 40 witnesses at that check had been looking, quite naturally, at Sir Rowland Ferrers, or at their own horses, or at the hounds working the far tree line, and not one of them, saving perhaps Miss Ferrers herself, had thought to notice who else stood, for a few unremarkable minutes, within arm's reach of a saddled, tethered, unwatched horse. He found Amos Grieve mending a fence at the boundary of his own land that afternoon, and the big farmer straightened at his approach with the same flat, wary look he had worn at the gate 2 days before, though there was something added to it now, Poirot thought, a tightness about the eyes that had not been there when the man had merely been discussing right-of-way with a stranger. "I hear, monsieur, that you came down to the check at Long Ash Spinney on the morning Sir Rowland died," said Poirot, without preliminary. "This surprises me a little, for you told me yourself you do not hold with hunting." Grieve's jaw worked for a moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice had none of its earlier flatness. It came out fast and low, the voice of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has, at last, simply set it down. "I'll tell you what I did, sir, and you can make of it what you please, for I've had 2 nights now without sleep for the thinking of it. I cut the wire along my bottom hedge that morning, before the meet, a length of it, low down in the gap where the hounds have been through twice this season, and near ruined my sheepfold doing it. I meant it for spite, God forgive me, meant the horses to have a rough crossing of it, and Ferrers to hear a complaint or two from his own field about my land, since he'd never listened to me. And then, when the poor man went over at the fence not 200 yards from where I'd cut it, I thought sure as anything they'd say it were my wire done it, tangled a hoof or some such, and I've not slept since for the fear of the noose, though I swear to you on my mother's grave I never touched that horse, nor came within 10 feet of it that whole morning, saving to stand at the gate a minute or two, while my own business with the huntsman was seen to." "The wire you cut," said Poirot, with the particular gentleness he reserved for a man confessing to the wrong crime, "was nowhere near the fence at which Sir Rowland fell, monsieur, and the injury to the horse was not, in any case, of a kind that any wire could have caused. You have carried a needless terror for 2 days over a piece of spite that harmed no one but, perhaps, your own conscience." Grieve's big shoulders sagged with a relief so total it was almost comic, and Poirot, walking back toward the hall with the fading afternoon light long across the frosted fields, found himself smiling very slightly, not at the farmer's foolishness, which was human and forgivable, but at the pleasing symmetry of a case that kept offering him guilty men with the wrong guilt, honest fear standing in so convincingly for murder that even the guiltless walked about looking like killers. Somewhere in that field of 40 riders, he thought, someone had counted precisely on that confusion, had known that a crowd is the safest place in England to do a quiet, careful, dreadful thing, because everyone in it is watching everyone else, and therefore, in the particular arithmetic of a public spectacle, no one at all. Chapter 8. The Heir's Arithmetic. Gerald Ferrers received Poirot in the small sitting-room that had been his uncle's own. A boy's error, Poirot thought, watching him move about the room with a restlessness he could not master, for a man with nothing to hide does not generally choose, on the second day of mourning, to conduct his conversations in the dead man's chair. "I don't see what more I can tell you, Monsieur Poirot," Gerald said, not sitting, turning instead to the window and back again in a short, unhappy circuit of the hearthrug. "I've told the inspector everything. I rode up to speak to my uncle at the check. He waved me off. He was talking to Aunt Amelia about the wretched church roof, and I rode on. I never went near the horse." "You are, I think, his heir," said Poirot, settling himself without invitation into the chair opposite, "and a man in some difficulty over money, if the gentleman called Hopgood is to be believed." The boy's colour, which had been high already, went higher still, and for a moment Poirot thought he would deny it outright, the reflex of a young man, raised to consider his private debts nobody's business but his own. Then, with the sudden, exhausted collapse of someone who has been holding a pose too long and can no longer sustain it, Gerald sat down heavily on the arm of a chair and put his face briefly in his hands. £6,000, he said, muffled. "Cards, mostly, and one very stupid investment a friend talked me into, and I have been 6 months telling Hopgood I'd have it settled by Christmas without the smallest idea how, because I would not, go to my uncle and confess it. He'd paid one debt of mine already, 3 years back, and told me plainly it was the only time, and Rowland was not a man who said a thing twice." "And now," said Poirot gently, "your uncle is dead, and you are his heir, and £6,000 that could not be found by Christmas will very shortly present no difficulty whatever." Gerald looked up, and there was in his face, Poirot thought, watching with the close, unsentimental attention he gave to every face in a case of this kind, something that interested him a great deal more than guilt would have done, a kind of horrified, unwilling relief, the look of a man who hears his own good fortune spoken aloud by another and is disgusted to find it is, In fact, exactly what he feels. "You think I don't know how that looks," he said, low and fast. "You think I haven't lain awake with it? That I am glad, God forgive me, glad in some wretched corner of myself that he's dead, because it solves in one stroke a thing I could see no way out of, and hating myself for the gladness worse than I could ever hate myself for the debt." He shook his head, and when he spoke again his voice had steadied into something flatter, more honest. "I didn't kill him, Monsieur Poirot. I loved him, in the stupid, resentful way one loves a man who is always right and never lets you forget it. But I did not kill him, and I will tell you the worst of it, since you seem set on drawing it out of me piece by piece. I am ashamed that his death has done for me what I could not do for myself, and I would give a great deal not to feel that shame, and an equal deal not to feel, underneath it, the relief. It was, Poirot reflected afterward, walking down through the cold gallery toward the library where Hastings and Inspector Farrow awaited his report, a confession of a kind, but not, he thought, the kind that mattered to the case at hand. A young man's guilty relief at a fortunate death was a common enough thing in families of property, and a poor foundation on which to build a murder, absent some more concrete thread connecting hand to horse. And Gerald Ferrers had been, by every account so far gathered, waved away by his uncle at the very moment the fatal minutes began, and had ridden off toward the front of the field, in full view of a dozen witnesses before the grey was ever left alone. "He is guilty of debt and of an ungenerous kind of grief," Poirot told Farrow, settling into his chair by the library fire. "But I do not think, mon ami, that he is guilty of murder. The man called Hopgood, now, he interests me rather more, for a creditor grown impatient with a debtor's promises has sometimes found it simpler to remove the obstacle between himself and payment than to continue waiting upon it, and Sir Rowland's death, whatever else it did, removed at a stroke the young man's excuse for further delay." "Hopgood wasn't at the check when the grey was saddled," said Farrow, consulting his notes with the flat satisfaction of a man closing off a line of inquiry. "Half a dozen witnesses put him well back in the field, talking horses with a farmer from Nethercombe, the whole 10 minutes together. Then we may set him gently to one side," said Poirot, "though not, I think, entirely out of mind, for a man may profit from a death without having caused it, and it is worth remembering, Inspector, that we have now examined the heir, the whipper-in, and the aggrieved farmer, and found in each of them a perfectly human, perfectly believable motive for wishing Sir Rowland ill, and in not one of them a motive strong enough, nor an opportunity clean enough, to satisfy me that we have found our murderer. It is, I confess, beginning to trouble me rather more than it comforts me, for somewhere in that field of 40 honest, frightened, grieving people, someone is lying with a composure that has not yet cracked, and I begin to suspect that we have none of us yet asked the right question of the right person." Chapter 9. The Salt Bin. It was a small, sharp-featured kennel boy of perhaps 14, mucking out the puppy run with the sullen thoroughness of a child who has been told twice to hurry, who gave Poirot the thread he had been waiting for, and gave it, as such things so often are given, without the smallest notion of its value. "Mucking's my job, sir, morning and evening," the boy said, when Poirot had drawn him into conversation over the business of a stiff gate hinge, "and salting the paths too, this time of year, on account of the ice on the flags where the water splashes from the trough. Big bin of it there is, by the tack-room door. Rock salt, the coarse kind, same as they put down on the roads." "And who has the use of this bin, mon petit?" "Anyone as needs it, sir, but it's Tom mostly fills it and sees it's kept dry, on account of he's particular about the flags icing over. Says a broken leg costs more than a bag of salt, and he's not wrong neither, seeing what happened to old Barker 2 winters back." Poirot walked out to examine the bin himself. A squat wooden box beside the tack-room door, its lid loose on worn hinges, and found within it precisely the coarse, ungainly, unrefined salt that a man wishing to disable a horse without arousing suspicion could scarcely have improved upon. Freely available, entirely unremarkable, and kept by the boy's own artless testimony under the particular and habitual care of Tom Rennick, whose devotion to the safety of the kennel paths had furnished him, quite incidentally, with an instrument of murder that no one in the household would ever have thought to connect to him, since a man may keep a salt bin filled for 100 honest reasons, and only, on one single morning, for a very different one. It was not, Poirot reflected, walking back toward the house with his hands clasped behind him in the particular manner that Hastings had long ago learned to recognize as the outward sign of a mind working with great rapidity beneath a calm exterior, proof of anything at all. A man might tend a salt bin for 20 years and never once misuse it. But it closed, neatly and quietly, the one gap in an otherwise complete opportunity. Means, now, sat beside motive and access as comfortably as 3 legs of a stool, waiting only for the fourth. The fourth came, as such things so often did in a case of this kind, from a source Poirot had rather expected and had been, in consequence, patiently waiting to hear from, Miss Amelia Ferrers's own maid, a quiet, watchful young woman named Ellen, who had been walking her mistress's spaniel along the ride that morning, at some little distance from the field, and whose account, taken almost as an afterthought by a constable more interested in the gentry's testimony than the servants', had lain unexamined in Farrow's notebook for 2 days, until Poirot, calling for it specifically, read it through twice with mounting interest, and asked to see the girl herself. "You saw the changeover of the horses, mademoiselle?" he asked her, in the small parlour Farrow had commandeered for interviews, and the girl, twisting her apron between her fingers with the discomfort of someone unused to being questioned by gentlemen, nodded slowly. "I did, sir, though I'd not have thought it worth mentioning. Only the officer asked had I seen anything unusual, and I said no, for I hadn't, not really, only—" She hesitated, and Poirot waited, with the patience of a man who had learned that a witness's own doubts were frequently more valuable than her certainties. "Only Tom went back to the grey, sir, after he'd finished with the saddle and stepped away. I noticed it particular because Bella, that's the spaniel, pulled toward the horses just then, and I had to hold her in, and while I was minding her, I saw Tom walk back to the grey's side a second time, just for a moment, and lean in close by the girth, as if he were checking something, and then step away again quick, before Sir Rowland came up to mount. I thought nothing of it at the time. A groom's forever fussing over a girth, isn't he? But he never said nothing about going back to it, when the inspector asked him after, only that he saddled the horse and stepped away, and that were the end of his part in it." Poirot sat very still for a moment, and Hastings, watching him from the window-seat, recognized the particular quality of that stillness. The stillness of a man who has just heard the last piece of a puzzle click quietly into a shape he had, in truth, half suspected for some time but had been unwilling, out of a fastidious regard for fairness, to declare before he was certain of it. "You are quite sure, mademoiselle," he said gently, "that it was Rennick who returned, and not some trick of the eye, at a little distance, in a crowded field?" "Certain, sir. I've known Tom Rennick 5 years, working about the place same as I have. I'd know his walk anywhere, and the way he holds his shoulders. It were him, right enough, and he went back to that horse when he'd no earthly need to, unless he'd forgot something the first time round." When she had gone, Hastings said, low and urgent, "Poirot, that's it, isn't it? That's your man. He lied to Farrow about going back to the horse, which means he's lying about something, and a man doesn't lie about a thing so small unless the truth of it hangs him." "It is very suggestive, mon ami," said Poirot slowly, rising and moving to the window with his hands still clasped behind him, looking out over the frosted lawn toward the kennels where a thin plume of smoke rose from the kennelman's cottage chimney into the pale afternoon sky. "It is, I think, very nearly enough, and yet a suggestion, however strong, is not yet a proof, and I have learned, across many years and many cases, that the moment one is most certain of a man's guilt is precisely the moment one must take the greatest care to be certain for the right reasons, and not merely because the answer has at last become convenient. Before I accuse Tom Rennick of murder, Hastings, I must first understand something that troubles me still. Why a man clever enough to conceive so patient and so vanishing a method of killing should be careless enough to return, in full view of a servant girl and a spaniel, to a horse he had already, and correctly, Prepared. Chapter 10. The Second Visit. Poirot found Tom Rennick in the tack room that evening, oiling a bridle by the light of a hurricane lamp, with the same unhurried, methodical hands that had, 2 mornings before, settled a blanket beneath a saddle in full view of 40 people who had not troubled to watch him do it. And he came straight to the point, for he had found, over many years, that a man given time to prepare a lie generally told a better one than a man surprised by the truth. You told Inspector Farrow that you saddled the grey and stepped away, and that was the whole of your part in it, Poirot said, settling himself on an upturned feed bin without invitation. You did not tell him that you returned to the horse a second time, before Sir Rowland mounted and leaned in close by the girth. The oiling cloth stopped moving. For a long moment Rennick said nothing at all, and the lamp hissed softly in the quiet, and somewhere out in the stable yard a horse shifted its weight and stamped once against the cold. "Who saw that?" he said at last, and his voice had gone very careful, very flat. "It does not matter who saw it, monsieur. It matters that it happened, and that you did not think, when a man's death was being inquired into, to mention it." Rennick set down the bridle with great precision, as though the ordinary business of his hands were the only thing holding him together, and when he looked up, his face had the grey, exhausted look of a man who has been carrying a weight alone for 2 days and has just felt it, for the first time, seen by someone else. "I went back to check the girth," he said. "That's God's truth, sir, whatever you make of it. I'm particular about a girth, always have been. 22 years I've never once had a saddle slip on a horse I'd tacked. And I stepped away that morning and then I thought, the strap's an old one, I ought to give it another pull before he's up. And I went back and I checked it, and it was sound, and I stepped away again, and that were the whole of it." He passed a hand over his face. "I didn't say it to the inspector because I could see, plain as day, how it would look. A man going back twice to a horse that killed his master within the hour. And I was a coward about it, sir, and I'm ashamed of that. But a coward isn't a murderer, whatever else he may be." "And yet," said Poirot gently, "it is precisely in that second visit, 30 seconds perhaps, no more, a man's hand at a horse's belly in a crowded field, where no one is watching a groom do an ordinary groom's work for the second time in 5 minutes, that a packet of salt and ice might have been slipped beneath a blanket that was, at the first saddling, entirely innocent. You have not given me an alibi, Monsieur Rennick. You have given me, I think without quite meaning to, the opportunity itself." Rennick's hands had gone still on the bench, and when he spoke again it was not with anger, nor with the practised indignation of a guilty man discovered, but with something Poirot found, on reflection, a great deal more troubling, a kind of weary, resigned honesty, the voice of a man who has stopped bothering to defend himself because he no longer expects to be believed. "Then I don't know what more I can say to you, sir, saving that it wasn't me, and that I've turned it over every hour since, lying awake, trying to think who else might have gone near that horse in the minutes I wasn't looking, for I'd my back to it a fair part of the time, seeing to the bay that Sir Rowland had just got down off, and a man can't watch 2 horses and mind his own hands at once." He looked up, and there was, for just a moment, something almost pleading in his face. Not the pleading of guilt, Poirot thought, but of a man watching the last person willing to hear him out draw slowly, inevitably, to a conclusion he could feel coming, and could not stop. "You said yourself, sir, that first day at the hedge, that a crowd's the safest place on earth to do a quiet thing. Well, I were part of that crowd same as 40 others, and I'll not pretend I hadn't cause to wish Sir Rowland less sharp-eyed about his accounts than he was. But wishing a man less sharp-eyed isn't wishing him dead, and I never touched that horse with anything but my own 2 honest, careless, over-particular hands." Poirot left him there among the bridles and the smell of neatsfoot oil and walked back across the darkening yard in a silence. Hastings, falling into step beside him, knew better than to break at once, and it was not until they had nearly reached the house that Poirot spoke again, half to himself, in the low, considering murmur he used, when a thought had not yet finished forming itself into words. "He is either the best liar I have encountered in 30 years, Hastings, or he is telling me, in every particular, the truth. And the difficulty, the very great difficulty, is that both of those things would look, this evening, in this yard, in this lamplight, exactly the same. He stopped walking and looked back once toward the lit window of the tack room, where a small, stooped shadow moved slowly about among the tack, putting the room to rights for the night with the patient, habitual care of a man who might, or might not, have used that same care to end another man's life. I begin to think, mon ami, that we shall not resolve this question by asking it again of Rennick. We must instead ask it of the horse. Chapter 11. The stablemate Poirot gathered them the following morning at the same covert where the hunt had first drawn 2 days before. The household, the constabulary, and such of the field as Pharaoh had thought proper to summon, standing in a loose, uneasy half-circle at the edge of Long Ash Spinney, while the frost, thinner now, silvered the grass one last time before the thaw that was surely coming. He had asked, the evening before, for one particular arrangement to be made, and a groom now led out from the stable-yard, the Grey's own stablemate. A bay gelding of similar age and temperament, saddled and blanketed as plainly and ordinarily as any horse in England, with nothing beneath its blanket but the blanket itself. "I have asked you all to indulge an old man in a small experiment," Poirot said, standing very upright in the cold, his hands folded before him, addressing the assembled company with the particular theatrical patience he permitted himself only at the close of a case. "You will forgive me if I explain what I have already told the inspector, that Sir Rowland Ferrers's grey did not stumble at that fence 2 mornings ago. It was made to bolt by pain, a device of salt and crushed ice, laid beneath the blanket, which stings a horse to madness for some 10 or 15 violent minutes, and then vanishes, by the horse's own heat, into nothing more than an innocent, damp patch. I shall now ask this groom to take the stablemate over the same fence, with nothing beneath its saddle but honest cloth, that you may all see for yourselves what a sound horse, unhurt, will do." The bay took the hedge cleanly, easily, without the smallest hesitation, landed square, and cantered on a dozen strides before the groom brought it round. Precisely, unremarkably, the way the grey itself had jumped that fence 100 times before the one morning it had not. And a murmur went through the watching field, the particular murmur of people watching a thing confirmed that they had already, in their private hearts, half believed. "You see," said Poirot, turning now, and producing from beneath his coat, wrapped carefully in a square of white linen, the saddle blanket taken from the grey 2 mornings before, still bearing at its centre the dark, dried stain rimmed faintly with a crust of salt, "that a sound horse jumps sound. It was not the ground, and it was not the fence, and it was not, whatever the good coroner first supposed, an accident of nature. Something was placed beneath this blanket, by a hand that knew precisely how long the ice would take to melt, and precisely how much salt would produce agony without producing a mark that any but the most careful eye would trouble to examine. It was Tom Rennick, standing a little apart from the others near the kennel gate, who spoke first. And it was, Poirot thought afterward, turning the moment over with a certain sad satisfaction, the very naturalness of the interruption that betrayed him. For an innocent man observing a demonstration says nothing at all, while a guilty one, watching his own careful work laid bare before a crowd, cannot always master the impulse to correct a detail. "Salt wouldn't do that," Rennick said, too quickly, his voice carrying clear across the frosted grass before he had fully weighed the wisdom of speaking at all. "Not laid flat beneath a blanket, not in the quantity you'd get in a handful. You'd need it packed tight against the hide, close by the girth line where the sweat runs heaviest, or the horse's own movement would work it loose and harmless inside a minute or two, long before." He stopped. The silence that followed was total, and into it, slowly, the whole field seemed to turn as one and look at him, and Poirot watched the exact moment the man understood what he had done. The colour draining from his face, the careful stillness of his hands, the stillness Poirot had marked in him 3 days before at the covert side, when Sir Rowland had told him Monday would be his last. "You have just told us, monsieur," said Poirot gently, into the silence, "precisely where such a thing must be packed, and precisely how long it would take to work, and precisely why a careless placing would fail where a careful one would not. A knowledge, I think, that no innocent groom, however skilled with a girth, would have troubled to acquire. For a long moment Rennick said nothing at all, standing very still among the watching field, with the particular stillness of a man who has, at last, run out of road. Then, quietly, without drama, without the confession scenes of melodrama, he said only, "He was going to let me go without the law touching me. I couldn't bear it, the mercy of it, worse than the punishment would have been, him looking at me like I were a dog that had bitten the hand that fed it, and forgiving me anyway, because he could afford to forgive, being the sort of man who never had to want for anything in his life. 22 years I gave that hunt, and he'd have had me gone inside a week with a character reference I didn't deserve and a kindness I couldn't stand. And I thought, God forgive me, I thought, better an accident than that mercy." His voice cracked, once, and steadied. "I never meant the ice to be so cruel a way of it. I only meant it quick." Farrow moved to take him then, quietly, without ceremony, and the field watched in a silence that had in it more sorrow than triumph. For there was little, Poirot thought, in the sight of a tired, ashamed, unremarkable man being led away between two constables, that any honest witness could call satisfying. Chapter 12. The Mercy He Couldn't Bear. They gave him tea in the library afterward, the whole shaken household, and Hastings, and Inspector Farrow before he drove back to the county town, with his prisoner beside him in the back of the car, silent and small and diminished in a way that had nothing to do with the handcuffs. And it was there, before the fire, that Hastings asked the question that had been sitting with him since the covert. "I still don't quite understand it, Poirot." The man had been forgiven. No prosecution, no scandal, just quiet dismissal, and a character reference he hadn't earned. Why murder, when mercy was the very thing being offered him? Poirot was quiet a moment, turning his teacup slowly on its saucer, and when he spoke, it was with none of the theatrical flourish of the covert, but something gentler and sadder. "Because, mon ami, mercy of that particular kind, mercy from a man who has never in his life had to want, given to a man who has spent his whole life earning what little he has, is not always received as a gift. It can be received as a verdict." Sir Rowland Ferrers did not merely forgive Rennick's theft. He named it, in the same breath, small, a thing beneath his own dignity to punish. 22 years of loyal, careful, invisible service, and one act of shame at the end of it, and the whole of it, weighed by his master, and found not even worth the trouble of the law. To a proud man, and Rennick is, beneath the quiet manner, a proud man, Hastings, prouder perhaps than Sir Rowland himself ever was, there are injuries a fist would heal faster than a kindness. But to kill him for it, he did not set out, I think, to kill anyone, said Poirot slowly. He set out, in the grip of a shame he could not master, and a resentment he did not fully understand himself, to arrange an accident, a fright, a fall, perhaps even nothing worse than a broken collarbone, and a humbled master who might, in his suffering, come to see the man beneath him a little more clearly. I do not believe Tom Rennick sat in that tack room 2 nights ago and planned a murder with a cold heart. I believe he planned a small, cruel, half-formed revenge, and did not trouble himself, because shame does not trouble itself with such questions, to imagine precisely how much pain a frightened, agonized horse might inflict upon the man in its saddle, at speed, at a fence, with nowhere soft to fall. Hastings was silent, turning this over, and it was Miss Amelia Ferrers, from the window seat where she had been sitting very still through the whole of this conversation, who spoke next, in a voice gone thin with 2 days' grief. "He came to the funeral arrangements yesterday morning, you know. Stood at the back of the church while we discussed the hymns, quite composed, and offered to see to the horses for the procession. I thanked him for it." She pressed a hand briefly to her mouth. "I thanked the man who had killed my brother-in-law for his thoughtfulness." "That, madame," said Poirot gently, "is very often the particular horror of this kind of crime. Not that the murderer is a monster unrecognizable among us, but that he is, in every other hour of every other day, an ordinary, careful, even a kind man, undone in one single hour by a wound to his pride, that the rest of us would never have thought to call a wound at all. It is why I did not arrest him on suspicion alone, though I confess I suspected him almost from the first evening. A man's whole life of decent service deserved, I thought, a certainty beyond mere probability, before it was undone in a single sentence before a crowd of his neighbours. There was little more to be said after that, and the household settled, in the slow, awkward way of a house recovering from a second shock atop a first, into the quiet business of grief and funeral arrangements, and the small, necessary business of continuing to live. It was toward evening, with Hastings gone ahead to see about the arrangements for their own departure the following morning, that Poirot found himself alone in the tack-room, drawn there by some impulse he did not examine too closely, and stood for a while in the fading light among the bridles and the smell of leather and oil, looking at the bench where Tom Rennick had sat 2 evenings before, oiling a bridle with hands that had, within the same week, saddled a horse both faithfully and fatally. The bridle itself still lay where the man had left it, half finished, one rein glossy with fresh oil, and the other still dull and dry, as though the work had simply stopped, mid-motion, and would now never be completed by the hand that had begun it. Poirot did not touch it. He stood a moment longer in the cooling dusk, listening to the ordinary evening sounds of a stable settling for the night, a horse shifting its weight, the soft complaint of a hinge, somewhere far off the huntsman's voice calling the hounds in to their supper, the world going on, indifferent and unhurried, exactly as it would have gone on had none of this happened at all. And then he turned up his coat collar against the cold and walked out across the darkening yard, leaving the unfinished bridle exactly as he had found it, one rein bright and one rein dull, and both of them now belonging to no one at all. The end.